Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. I hope you all are doing well. Before I start, I would like to apologize for this simpler setup. You don't see any books in the background, and it's kind of drab, but as I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, we are in the process of moving, and I'm still setting up my new at home recording studio. But I thought I should take some time to start a new conversation. And in today's talk, I would like to start a conversation about decolonial studies, or decolonization as it is called, or decolonial thought. And I have titled this video as The Darker Side of Decolonial Studies. And that's, of course, a play on Walter Manvolo's own work, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, right, where he actually discusses the concept of decolonial thought in opposition to Western thought, but also in that discussion, he props up postcolonialism and its Eurocentricity as another example against which he theorizes decolonial thought. Now, my idea is that a lot of people don't read Walter Manvolo carefully. And then what they suppose about decolonialism and decolonial thought is also not really very well thought out. And what they ascribe to postcolonial studies is always usually highly reductive. And because of that, there is a new way of thinking emerging here, but also in the colonies, in the post colonies, where people are increasingly re-invoking these irrevocable, immutable, generalized, and almost essentialized binaristic tropes, which trap us again into this us and them mentality, right? And the purpose of postcolonial studies, beyond so many other things, was to make that binary fluid, right? And to learn to speak from this interstitial gap, right, as Baba speaks, or from that third space of enunciation of a sign. That was and is the beauty of postcolonial studies, because as a discipline, as a field of study, it is absolutely not committed to one singular way of thinking or looking at the world. It appropriates, it takes knowledge from here, from there, from elsewhere, all mobilized towards telling the story of colonization, telling the story of resistance, and telling the narratives of how post-colonial nation states exist and cope with the current hegemonic economic system and the dominance of the North Atlantic region. That is what is the beauty of post-colonial studies. But decolonial studies, as being practiced, especially in certain parts of the world, I think loses what Manvolo had wanted from it or had theorized about it, and becomes a very concrete and almost intolerant way of thinking the world. And that's what I wanted to talk about today in general terms. I will come back with a more specific webinar where I have certain works that I've read and certain works of Manvolo himself, and then I'll do a comparison. But I thought I should do a general discussion of it first. By the way, you're seeing my cat running around. His name is Arjun, and he's staying with me in my apartment. So here is the advantage that Walter Manvolo has when he is theorizing the concept of Panchamama, or the concept of ecological living of the Incas, or before that, the pre-colonial cultures of South America. He is imagining a cosmology, right? And within that, he's retrieving the communal aspects of it, the pacifist aspects of it, and the aspects of it which worked in sync with the world as it existed, right? Temporality is this different. The way people experience time is different. So his proposal is that instead of thinking in Western reason, which most of the times becomes instrumental, right, and is in the service of capital, if we could develop decolonial thought, which doesn't rely on Europeans' mode of thinking, especially instrumental logic, then we can create a cosmology and a kind of reason that is in tune with nature, right? That takes into account the earth itself as a constituent element of our existence, right? As one of us, right? That was the project, right? And eco-criticism people already work with that. But what has ended up happening in some sectors of post-colonial world is people have equated decolonial studies to retrieving purely religious histories and not mobilizing them to change the metropolitan culture or to metropolitan ways of thinking, but to assert that this is the right way of thinking. This is what we must retrieve. This is how must we articulate modernity, right? So if you go to Pakistan, chances are people would be Islamizing thought. There is nothing wrong with retrieving philosophy from the Islamic history. I have done that myself. But to insist that that alone can answer all our questions, I think is kind of misleading. And if we make that retrieval of Islamic philosophy, Islamic history, into a purest form of thinking the world, right? Then what we are doing as scholars, philosophers, and literary critics is the very thing that Taliban are doing, which ISIS is doing, because they also want to excise all Western knowledge from their understanding of the world and re-articulate the world and rebuild it into the image that they have retrieved from the past. Now, do keep in mind that those retrievals are neither pure nor singular, right? Those are not a monolithic retrieval. Depending on what your sect is, which scholar do you follow, you will retrieve a certain aspect of Islamic history and mobilize it towards your purpose. So the darker side of decolonial thought, which imagines a world in which you can completely jettison all aspects of Western thought and retrieve just a purely postcolonial or decolonial thought, the darker side of it is that it can lead us into the avenues of new hierarchies of exclusion, right? New hierarchies of systems built around thought, which was developed 500-600 years ago, right? And if you make it either counter-modern or pre-modern, then you're living in the 21st century trying to think the world with the thought of 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th century, right? That is the disadvantage there. Now, if you look at India, the same thing is happening over there. What we call Hindu chauvinism or the Hindu nationalism is also a retrieval, idealized retrieval of Hindu mythologies in opposition to Muslim history and then the colonial history, and asserting that India is Hindu and Hinduism is the only way in which India can succeed and become even greater, right? That then also creates a darker modernity, right? Because the influences that came from outside and that transformed India are now considered to be impurities that must be removed, right? Similarly, if you also say Marxism and Western democracies and Western democratic systems are also impurities and must be excised and removed, then you will constantly keep going back to pre-modern ways of thinking the world. What's wrong with that? Now, if you've read your Ernest Gilner and his book on nationalism, one thing that I learned from him is that depending on what mode of production exists, there's always a political system corresponding with that. So if you think of the feudal system of the medieval Europe or India or China, the corresponding system with that was that economies were agricultural and political systems were by and large feudal. So what ends up happening is if you are retrieving something pre-modern and you're not giving it a chance to compete with ideas as it exists today in the world and then retransform itself, change itself, make itself contemporary, then you're picking up something that is ossified, that is old, offering it to us as something pure that can solve all our problems, but which forces us to live our lives or think our lives according to the reason and cosmologies of 7th, 8th, ninth, 10th century. And how is that supposed to make our lives better? I have not figured it out yet as a secular scholar. So, I mean, even if you read Chinwe Zhu, Decolonizing the African Mind, where he proposes that Africa will only succeed if it jettisons the Arab influence and the European influence, even Chinwe Zhu does not believe in pure retrieval of an African past and mobilizing it in the past. He constantly points out that yes, we must retrieve it, we must save it, but we must do it within industrial capital, within modernity, right? That's his emphasis, that there is nothing wrong with retrieving a mode of thinking or a mode of experiencing the world from the past. But it must exist in today's world, right? So that's why I'm calling these practices, not all of them, but the ones that I mentioned, as the darker side of decolonial thought. Because if not done deftly enough, if not done with a certain degree of care, it devolves into a purist way of looking at one's own culture, and then it starts relying on those pre-existing binaries that were the hallmark of the colonial thought process, colonial reason itself. And that, to my mind, is not necessarily a productive place to be as a scholar. That's why I constantly encourage my students, my colleagues, as well as those of you who listen to these lectures, is to place yourself, in between spaces, right? Figure out what is the best in this way of thinking that I can take. What is the best in my own culture that I can bring to bear upon it? How do I mix the two, right? And what do I create from it? That is a more productive space. That is a more promising exercise, right? In all aspects of human interactions, politics, economics, historiography, cultural studies. So I thought I should start this conversation about my thoughts about a certain kind of decolonial studies being practiced in India and Pakistan and other post colonies, which in one way or the other itself becomes highly essentialist and binaristic. And that is what I'm calling the darker side of decolonial thought. Now, as promised, I'll come back with more focused conversations about this, where I will cite the people, especially Walter Manvolo, and give my argument in a more sophisticated manner. But I thought I should at least start the conversation. So that's all I have for now. I hope this was useful to you. I hope you all are still taking care of yourself and each other during the pandemic. I hope you stay safe, take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.